can remember the first time I ever heard this story of Jesus' journey to the cross. It seems as if I've always known it. I must have learned it, I guess, as a small child, although it's not really a story you'd pick to tell a child, necessarily. I mean, it's not a nice, gentle bedtime story. But I learned it, as perhaps many of you did, along with a number of other stories about this man Jesus, about how he healed the hurting, how he brought the dead back to life, how he was so loved by the crowds that they followed him wherever he went, even into the wilderness where there was no food for them. And then he worked a miracle to feed the hungry. It's not an original thought, but I think it's a curious thing that the central book of our faith isn't a book of rules or even a book of prayers. It's a storybook. Our faith is built on these stories. This is how we understand who we really are. Because being Christian is a way of life. It permeates all we do. In many ways, it's a cross-shaped way of life. It means not only, like the prayer, one of the prayers in our prayer book, not only that Jesus stretched out his arms upon the whole hard wood of the cross in order to embrace the whole world, it also means that our lives are cross-shaped in the sense that we reach out to our brothers and sisters and look up to God. These stories are all about that life, and there's room in the stories for us to enter into them, to explore their meaning. But the problem when you know a story really well, as I do, is that it loses its novelty. It can become ordinary, and after a while, it becomes harder and harder to notice what's really distinctive about it. And even if you're someone here for whom this is a relatively new story, it's possible that when you heard it the first time, you also heard an explanation that you accepted or not, but that stopped you from further exploration of this story. The week ahead, Holy Week, is a time that's set aside for us to revisit these stories, to see how God himself encountered death and overcame it. But that's getting ahead of the story. Holy Week invites us to imagine for ourselves what it was like to be there in the last days of Jesus' life. To imagine what it was like to be in that roaring crowd, hailing your hero. It must have been more thrilling than any inaugural parade or sports victory parade that you might have been in. And to imagine then what it would be, must have been, to be so afraid for your own skin that you abandon your hero and run for your life. The man you've given your life to, you desert in his time of need. And then to see your champion brutally killed and know that you failed him. And to lose all hope in what you had believed in. You had believed that he was the Savior, not knowing how that story would unfold. His death was a crushing blow to his followers. We are shaped and reshaped by the telling of these stories in ways that we may not even be aware of. They tell us who we are. They tell us how we live. And they're like family stories, really. I have lots of stories in my family about where we came from and how we got here. And, you know, they shape everyone in my family as we go forward. So for us, with these stories, they're here for us to constantly re-examine what they mean for our own lives. It's not that the truths they contain change, but we have to think again about how to live that out in the time and place we find ourselves. So I encourage you in this coming week to immerse yourself in these stories and to let yourself be in them and feel what they're like and imagine what they're like. It was actually a desire for a very personal experience of the stories about Jesus last week that led to the sort of creation of Holy Week as we observe it. In the 4th century, pilgrims started to travel to the Holy Land, and in particular, they would go during the week before Easter, and they would go to the sites where each of these stories was believed to have happened, and they would reenact them and hear readings about them and sing about them. And especially they would try to follow the path of Jesus' last day, to walk the Via Dolorosa. I have never been to the Holy Land. Maybe some of you have done that. But as it became more impractical to travel that way, these observations of the week were brought back to us and became our Holy Week. That walking the Via Dolorosa became what we call Stations of the Cross. So we'll be reenacting those things this week, and I encourage you, if you can, to be here. We'll be celebrating Maundy Thursday, the Last Supper on Thursday. We'll have our own stations, the same ones that you had last year. On Friday, we'll celebrate the great vigil of Easter with a Eucharist on Saturday. Each of those is at 7 p.m. And I know how life is, and some of you will be traveling, and some of you will have family and other things. So I know you can't all be here, but even if you can't be here, I encourage you to take some time and spend some time with these stories during the week, to imagine them and pray with that. In Holy Week, we try to hear this story again as if for the first time. A man arrives in town to celebrate a holiday and is recognized by people who have seen him teaching and preaching, who feel drawn to him and are so thrilled to see him that they treat him like a king entering into the city. But meanwhile, there's a plot unfolding, and it's not going to turn out well. The authorities are threatened by his popularity. He's betrayed by an insider, by one of his closest friends. His other friends are so frightened they run for their lives, and he knew that was going to happen, and he told them so, and they were all sure that they would stay with him, but they don't. There's a trial. It is truly a travesty of justice. He's condemned to death and mocked by the soldiers who are guarding him. He's abandoned and put to death. Brutal and shameful death. Crucifixion was not only painful, but truly a shameful way to die in that culture. And finally, he's buried in someone else's tomb. That cry, which I felt chills when AC said, my God, why have you forsaken me?" This is a tragic story. And that's as far as we go today. Holy Week isn't a time to jump to the happy ending. It's a time to ponder deeply all that went before that. And I want to suggest some themes to consider in relation to this story. And I don't think this is an exhaustive list by any means of all possible themes, but these are some of the things that occurred to me as I sat with this story during the past week. First of all, there's what it tells us about God, about the very nature of God. The epistle reading, the reading from the letter to Philippi, a great hymn of the early church, tells us that he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, humbled himself, and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. I want to ask you to look not just at the brutality of the execution, but also how Jesus gave himself freely to it. He never hesitated. He never tried to get away. He told his defenders to put the swords away. Surely, he said, if I wanted out of this, my Father could stop it in a minute. But the power of the cross is not that kind of power. It's the power that he didn't. The cross is the central symbol of our faith precisely because of the way Jesus embraced it. And this is a reminder, I think, to us that we too are called to give of ourselves. God is love, yes, but it's not a sweet, easy kind of love. It's a challenging love. Another theme to think about is Jesus' request that his disciples stay with him. That's really all he asked of them. Stay with me, he said. And they failed him. They fell asleep in the garden. They ran away when he was arrested. They denied him when they were asked about him later. And Jesus dies alone, except for the women who are watching from afar. And despite all this, he never turns his back on his friends. We don't hear bitterness, sadness maybe, but no bitterness. Our God is a God who knows human sorrow and pain intimately, who is there with us in our pain. Can we stay with him even through this week? And even more than that, where do we see the face of God among our brothers and sisters? And how do we stay with them in their times of need? Okay, one last theme. This is a story in which our heroes, our hero, all go against the popular culture. Often the gospel shows Jesus teaching people teachings that are against the popular culture, and not just apart from, not just different from, but really against. We see that the empire has no use for Jesus. We see that Jesus' own church fails him utterly. His teachings contradicted their values, and our fundamental Christian values still set us apart, and they're meant to. Don't be fooled into thinking otherwise. We value care for the poor and marginalized, not the pursuit of possessions or power. We value compassion, not judgment. We know that life isn't meant to be happy and easy all the time. Who is our society and even our church letting down today? Who isn't here today because they thought they wouldn't be welcomed if they came, and what can we do about that? So our faith has many paradoxes, beginning with the idea of a God who emptied himself and took the form of a slave. We have a faith that's focused on a cross. It's paradoxical but true that our joy comes out of tragedy. Our story today is a heartbreaking story about love, betrayal, hopes dashed, political intrigue, fear, bravery, abuse of power, bitter regret, injustice, pain, loneliness, and death. And yet we say it's the greatest story ever told. In short, it's a story about the human condition at its worst, and eventually it's about how God redeemed that. So this week, don't just think about it, but immerse yourself in the story of the cross. Let it become part of you and you part of it. And ponder how God is calling you to respond. The joy will come, I promise that, but the gospel today does not end in joy. It ends with the proclamation of the centurion, which we all said because it belongs to all of us too. Truly, this man was the Son of God. That is our faith and the source of all our hope. Amen.